Thank you. I am quite obviously pregnant, and I was pregnant when I wrote my book about pornography, and having been pregnant twice since 2005, I've pretty much been pregnant every time I've had to think and talk about this subject, which to me seems kind of incongruous because while pornography and pregnancy both ostensibly have to do with sex, I would wager that most men, when they are looking at pornography, the last thing they want to do is think about pregnancy. And most women, when they are pregnant, the last thing we want to think about is pornography. Nonetheless, I will speak about it today. I'm not going to read to you from my paper. My assumption is that you all have it, and I'm not going to read from my book, but I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why I wrote this book and some of the reaction I've gotten to it. The book came out of a story that I wrote for Time back in 2004. Basically, we were planning an issue on sex and the mind, and being a contributor who doesn't work in the office, I sort of got the notice the last, and everything had pretty much been taken from the effects of sex on the brain to S&M. So I asked the question, well, what about pornography? And really, from a repertorial perspective, I wanted to know, well, there's all this pornography out here, obviously. It was 2004. This was actually before Paris Hilton sex tape. It was before Janet Jackson at the Super Bowl, but it had nonetheless become obvious that the internet had really transformed pornography. And the way in which people consume it. And so I wanted to know how that affected the men who used it and the women generally that they were in relationships with. I focused on heterosexual pornography. So I wrote this story. It came out in January of 2004. And it was interesting to me because obviously the issue was about sex, so there was a lot of interesting, titillating subject matter in there. But my article sort of shot to #1 and then emailed list and got a huge reaction from readers, one of which I'm going to read to you was on the internet, and it was written by some guy named Bob in Chicago. The title was "Internet at Risk of Total Mommy Control." Warning to married guys everywhere. This week's Times Magazine features an article by why it's not good for married men to look at adult sites on the internet. This article is written by none other than Pamela Paul. That's right. Do you think maybe Pamela is a mommy? Let me tell you, boys, the mommies are coming for our internet. We have been beaten by them into submission about drinking, smoking, speeding, and just about every other fun guy's activity. We are now law-abiding, tax-paying, proper citizens who are willing to do just about whatever we are told just to make the pain stop. Then along comes a beacon of light in the wilderness. It's called the internet, and it features for nothing more than the monthly cost of service, pictures of girls wearing things our wives won't wear anymore and doing things that our wives won't do anymore. Yes, this harmless activity can be done in the safety of our own homes, which is typically a mommy requirement anyway, and costs far less than a night at the local gentleman's club, so it doesn't drain the family budget. Sound good? Absolutely not. The objective of mommydom is to control every aspect of a guy's life, regardless of whether it achieves anything good for him or mommy. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. In mommy's mind, to control their man is good. So what then of the internet? 'Tis bad, 'tis very bad. You are a bad dog. Turn off that porn, you selfish man, you. You are single-handedly ruining the relationship by making mommy feel powerless because you don't have to wait for her to hand out sex. You can just substitute it by looking at it on the internet. They're coming, boys. The mommies are coming to take our internet away, and now they've recruited Time Magazine and all the psychologists whose opinions they've included in these ridiculous articles. By the way, this betrays a very interesting concept about how journalism works, to make us feel guilty for partaking in a purely harmless activity. Why? Because mommies must have control. And when they are done and you've given up using the internet because they've convinced you that you are bad for using it in such a destructive way, you will sit there with nothing left in your life and ask, what happened? Well, I have to say I read that and it motivated me to look into this more. I was far from deterred. And so I decided to write a book about it. And to really research it in depth for a number of reasons. Obviously, there's only so much that can go into a 3-page story in Time Magazine, and I felt that there was a real need to explore it in greater depth. And the other reason, and this is going to affect the content of my talk today, is that there's a lot about pornography that you can't print in Time Magazine. And it's the book is very graphic, and it's not graphic, obviously not to titillate, but a little bit, yes, to shock, because I think that what happens when people talk about pornography is we talk about pornography, we say commercialized depictions of sex, we say images of naked women, but I think that without going into the specifics of what is out there, you cannot really understand what the issue is. And so I apologize in advance. I am going to use some graphic language in this talk, and I'm glad that the one person under 18 has left the room. And I do it not to upset people, though maybe a little bit I do, because while those of us who have been studying this are well aware of what I'm going to read to you and to talk to you about, those who aren't, I think that it will be eye-opening. So I wrote this book. I basically did my research in three ways. One is I really looked at the culture out there, looked at around on the internet. It was a dark period. It's a wonder that the daughter that was then inside me is a happy, well-adjusted child. And I also talked extensively to men who used pornography, to the women that are or had been in relationships with men who used pornography, and to psychologists, to child development experts. I didn't talk directly to children, but about the experience, the impact that it has on children and on families in general. And I also conducted a nationally representative poll by Harris to look at some attitudes about pornography, because so many of the polls that are out there, it really bears examining the methodology, because so many of it are internet polls that most of you know the drawbacks of those kind of polls, and the results are really skewed. So first of all, I want to talk about the myths of pornography, what we supposedly know about pornography, and obviously I think all of these are false, but these are really the prevailing myths in our culture. One is all men look at porn. It's human nature. Men are biologically programmed to be visually stimulated. 2, porn is harmless. It's just looking at pictures. What's wrong with fantasy? 3, if we women want to be naked and be proud of our bodies, what's the problem? We're in control, and it's our choice. 4, if you're sex positive, you like sex, you're adventurous, you're self-confident, then you should have no problem with porn. And 5, only scumbags use pornography, so who cares what a bunch of lowlifes do? Before I start debunking some of these ideas, I want to make a few things clear. First of all, I think it's really obvious today just how pornified the culture we live in is. I think it's only gotten that much worse since I was researching the book. Just last week, I was reading a story that came out about this new trend of sexting. I don't know if you've heard about it, but 21% of teenage girls post naked pictures of themselves online or on their phones and send them to their then boyfriends, who supposedly will cherish it for the rest of their lives in solitude. But of course, that isn't what ends up happening, and these girls are basically pornifying themselves publicly. The second thing is I want to make clear, obviously, how much the internet has changed the pornography landscape. This is no longer a world in which you can sort of, you have to skulk down to the adult store in a bad neighborhood and risk, bumping into your boss or your boss's wife and have to explain yourself. But everyone can go online and look at pornography anonymously, completely, often for free, and with little consequence. And there have been a number of studies recently that have come out looking at the number of people who look at pornography in the workplace and how this is affecting productivity, et cetera. And then lastly, what I mean by pornography. I'm not talking about Playboy, I'm not talking, which I find frankly offensive in and of itself, but I'm talking about things like meatholes.com. I'm talking about genital torture. I'm talking about a website that advertises something called the asshole milkshake. I won't describe what that is. So I'm going to ask a few questions about pornography and hope to answer them briefly. The first is, do all men look at porn, and is there a type of person who looks at pornography? Does pornography have an effect on the men who use it sexually, psychologically, socially? Third, does pornography have an effect on those around the porn user, the girlfriend, the wife, the coworker, the child? And finally, what is the effect of exposure of pornography on children? First, do all men look at porn, and is there a type? My research, I found that generally no. not all men look at pornography. All men who look at pornography think that all men look at pornography, but that's not true. There are men who just don't find it interesting, or for whatever moral, practical, personal reasons decide not to look at it. It's funny, however, when you ask men who look at pornography, what kind of man wouldn't look at pornography, their answer is, well, someone who is highly religious. That actually is not true, because religious people look at pornography too, and I spoke to ministers who used pornography and had become addicted to it, and to other religious leaders who had dealt extensively with pornography as an issue among their followers. So really I found that married men, single men, educated, non-educated, white-collar, blue-collar, lawyers, educators, businessmen, customer service representatives, and a lot of people who work in technology look at pornography. There really was not a basic sort of signifier that I could come up with to mark someone who looks at pornography. Second question is, does pornography have an effect on the men who use it sexually and psychologically? The myth is that pornography has no effect on people, that you're just looking at images and you shut your window browser and you're done. But that's of course like saying that anyone who sees an advertisement isn't affected by it, that anyone who comes to this conference won't come away with any new information or ideas, which would all make our jobs kind of pointless. So quite obviously it has an effect, and I'm just going to read to you two brief passages from the book from men I interviewed. So this is verbatim. The first guy, I call him Rajiv. He was a 28-year-old who wrote me in an email before I interviewed him, and it said, "I used to view porn online, but I began to find it more difficult to stay aroused when having sex with a real woman. It's an interesting feedback loop, because I watched porn before I ever had sex, and in the old days, if I was having trouble staying around for other reasons, e.g. too drunk, I could visualize scenes from these movies, and that would help. But later on, during a dry spell, I discovered eye porn, and the easiness of it made it easy to glut, to the point where now, even though the dry spell is over, real sex has lost some of its magic, and that's sad." And he wanted to do the interview because he wanted to figure out if there was a solution, if it could be fixed and he could get the magic of sex back, which I found incredibly sad. The next person, I'm going to read a few passages, and this is very graphic. But this guy, I call him Dave in the book. He's in his early 30s, very attractive guy, Harvard graduate, works in investment banking, what a lot of women would think of as a catch. He's single. And I talk a lot about, this is in the coming after a long discussion of him, his discussion of his pornography use and how he got into it. Recently, Dave has come across what he calls, quote, "disturbingly brutal images of women and men with very large penises." His intense excitement surprised him. Quote, "Basically, the men are having sex with these women's faces, and the women are gagging on cum and on the dicks, and they're slobbering because it's multiple guys, one right after the other. And these images are on sites where you know what you're getting, because the websites have names like fucker face and cock brutality and meat holes." Dave lets out an abrupt laugh. "I know objectively that it's horrid, but I have to admit that some of the images have been real turn-ons. This is going to sound ridiculous," he warns, "but I do prefer images where she's lying on her back with her head bent back towards the floor, and the guy is inserting his penis down her throat. He also likes it when she's getting stimulated at the same time and giving oral sex simultaneously. Quote, "I like the concept of pleasure and torture at the same time," he explains. "I like the idea that her throat is just being used to get this guy off," unquote. By comparison, a, quote, "pure image of a guy, quote, just getting off while a woman closes her eyes and opens her mouth is, quote, kind of boring. It somehow seems too plain. But if the woman is having sex with one guy while the others are getting off on her, coming all over her, on her face, her breasts, her body, that's really good. Still, his enjoyment bothers him in a way. Quote, "I know a lot of this violates the dignity of a woman," he says. Quote, "When I realized how sexually turned on I was by this stuff like bukkake," which is a popular form of pornography online. It comes from Japan. The image is usually of multiple men ejaculating on a woman's face while she cries. There are a lot of variations, but that's the basic. "When I realized how sexually turned on I was by stuff like bukkake, what I would do is force myself to stop and separate things in my head. I would make myself think, yes, that was an enjoyable fantasy, but no, that is not the way I want to be with anyone. I wish more people stopped and thought about it that way, quote. Just going to read one more passage of Dave, and then we will be out of this environment. Dave was talking about how his use of pornography has increased. He always looks at pornography at home. There's no way he would look at it at his financial firm where internet use is monitored assiduously. He started off by looking 2 or 3 times per week, then got up to 5 or 6 times weekly. Because he's a self-professed cheapskate and doesn't want to pay for anything, Dave will often spend large amounts of time scrolling through images until he finds something to turn him on. Quote, there's a lot of flipping back and forth trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. You will find something good and then, oh no, he's slapping her, and something that was a turn-on gets cut short. It's a rocky road, unquote. But the challenge, the chase, is part of the enjoyment. Quote, there's a fluttery feeling in your stomach because you know you're getting away with something illicit, he explains. It's like gambling, like a gambling addiction trigger. You'll see something that's pretty exciting and titillating, and you want more of that. You really want more of that. You keep hunting. You'll want to find something, but even more so. You're like a gambler, just playing one more hand until you win. After Dave finds what he's looking for and gets off, he dumps his computer cache, quote, I guess I just don't want to leave a trail of where I've been or what I was looking at, and goes to bed. Quote, I feel like, yeah, that was a release, but I don't know, maybe not the best thing, like eating a bag of potato chips. Somehow you always consume too much. In Dave's world, masturbation and computers may as well be wired together. For the past 6 months, he hasn't masturbated without looking at internet pornography. More than a few times, Dave has spent well over 2 hours at the computer, masturbating 2 or 3 times per sitting. On these occasions, he feels, quote, pretty ridiculous. As a result, Dave has experimented with restricting or, quote, reining in his use of online pornography. There was a time when he limited himself to weeknights only because, as he put it, quote, if I looked on weekends, there was no reason to keep me from staying up until all hours with it, unquote. Lately, he's tried to keep himself to 2 times a week because he's in a relationship. Quote, to avoid dulling my sexual response too much, he explains. I'd rather save any pent-up energy and excitement for the real thing than let it dissipate through masturbation. Sometimes, while he's having sex with a woman, Dave will start thinking about pornography, things he's seen, things he's liked. He'll conjure up images voluntarily to maintain and enhance his arousal, or the image will just pop up in his head spontaneously. Dave doesn't tell his partner what he's thinking about. So this was from a guy who, when I originally approached him about this, he was like, oh yeah, I'd love to talk about it. Didn't consider himself a pornography addict, didn't consider himself to have a problem with pornography at all. In fact, he talked about this very openly. We talked for several hours, followed up a few times. He told me that afterwards he felt like he had gone to therapy and that it had been really helpful. Anyway, but what he said was not atypical of a lot of the men, again, who were using pornography and didn't consider themselves addicts or to have any kind of problem, but they described trouble achieving orgasm. They had trouble looking at women the way in which they used to. Their standards of attractiveness had changed. They were having trouble with their relationships. So, you know, does pornography have an effect on the men who use it? Again, the dialogue about pornography in decades past has really been about the effect on women, and I think without adequate attention to the effect on the people who are using it most, that in addition to being degrading to women, pornography is incredibly degrading to men, that even the men who looked at porn look down on men who they think are too into it. I had numerous men talk to me about how they would go to strip clubs and they'd look over at the other guys and think, oh my God, those guys are so pathetic. And, well, if all of those people are thinking that the other ones look pathetic, how do you think you look? So I found that the men who looked at pornography were often dissatisfied. Only 28% of them said that they thought pornography improved their sex lives, and 68% said it had a negative impact or no impact. They were disaffected. They kept getting pulled into harder and harder pornography in order to keep the buzz going. Preoccupied. They would look at pornography online more than any other subject. 2/3 of 18 to 34-year-old men visit a pornographic site every month. And I would say that all these statistics about internet use are vastly understated, and every company that tracks this will tell you that. And this is all methodological, but it has to do primarily with the fact that most of the tracking firms only look at the major pay sites, and they don't track all the many millions of smaller free sites. So everything you get is a huge underestimation. But it nonetheless still, in this official estimate, ends up to half an hour on average with online pornography each week. but most men that I talked to said that they spent at least that much each day. They're disconnected. They eventually lose the ability to relate to or be close to women in real life. And then, of course, there is the loss of time, the hours wasted online. And this came up especially when men were in relationships with women who they might be married to, they might have several children with. Anyone who has, young children or children of any age knows that the demands on a man's time are already enormous. And to think of adding in an hour or two a day to pornography rather than, helping unload the dishwasher or drive a child to soccer, the impact becomes, on a daily basis, huge. Never mind the psychological effects, obviously. So that brings me to the next question, which is, does pornography have an effect on those around the porn user, the girlfriend, the wife, the coworker, and the female friend? I can't tell you. It was very disquieting. I talked to mostly women in their 20s and 30s, but up through their 50s. But the 20 and 30-something women basically felt that if you don't like porn, you have to keep quiet about it. Because women who, quote, weren't cool with porn were considered to be unsexy, unhip, jealous, reactionary, not sex positive, basically nobody you would ever want to date. It was very common for women to talk about the guys they date to have pornography around, to openly look at it on personal gadgets or online together with their other friends and in their company, and expect them to be perfectly fine with that. 6 in 10 women believe that pornography affects how men expect them to look. 4 in 10 men agree. And even college-age women I spoke with were contemplating getting breast implants, for example, to keep up with porn stars. 6 in 10 women also believe that porn changes men's expectations of how they should behave, and they felt that they were forced to compete on all fronts. And finally, betrayed. 1/3 of women see pornography, men using pornography as cheating in absolutely all cases. Only 17% of men equate pornography with cheating. 4 in 10 Americans say that pornography harms relationships between men and women. Nearly half of women describe a fallout in relationships. Only 1/3 of men say the same thing. I'm going to read you another email, and I got hundreds of emails from readers after this book came out. Really, some of them very moving. This is from, I think, a 20-something woman. My story. I dated Jason for about 3 months when we began pretty much to cohabitate. After almost a year, he began talking about marriage. After 9 months, he bought me a ring. I was in heaven. At about the 1-year mark, though, he started to become distant. He claimed he was just tired due to his unusually long work hours and his inability to sleep at night. As the next 3 months progressed, he became so distant that he did not even want sex. We never talked about the wedding anymore. He never actually ended up giving me the ring. I realize there are many reasons why Jason could become distant: fear of commitment, attraction to other women, immaturity, who knows. What I do know is that after about 3 months of distance and about 3 weeks of no intimacy, I went to debug our computer. Imagine my shock when I went to weed out the internet cache and found countless porn site cookies. I was horrified. As you probably know, a web cookie tells the date when the cookie originated and the last access times and as well. You already know what I'm going to tell. Most of the cookies originated over the prior 3 weeks, and he was accessing them late at night when he, quote, couldn't sleep. I was so hurt, angry, and betrayed that I sat at the computer shaking. I dug further and found that he was purchasing streaming videos, no download, no trail, from at least one site. I shudder to think about the stuff I was unable to find. I left him that day. When I did my research, and this information obviously is a bit outdated because this was now 5 years ago, but nearly 2/3 of divorce attorneys at the 2003 meeting of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers had witnessed a sudden rise in divorces related to the internet. 58% of those were the result of a spouse looking at excessive amounts of pornography online. Finally, what is the effect of pornography on exposure on children? And I think this is mostly and very frighteningly unknown. Obviously, it's very hard to do research on this area. But what's worse is that experts say today that there really is no way that children are not going to see pornography. They're going to get around the filters. They can go to any public library. As you know, there's no restriction in the public library. Even if they are not looking at it themselves, somebody in the cubicle next to them might be looking at it. This is the landscape in which parents have to operate. The hypotheses are that children will have sex earlier, that children will learn to sexually cue to violent and degrading images, that each child will learn distorted ideas about the other wants. I mean, I shudder to think about a 10-year-old girl who comes across bukkake and thinks that this is what boys want from me, to be, crying while multiple men ejaculate on my face. I also think that this is direct tied to the girl-on-girl sexual behavior among teenagers. Among 18 to 24-year-olds who came of age with internet pornography, more than half say it's hard to go online without seeing pornography. And a staggering 71% report that they have seen more on pornography online and offline, which is twice the number for baby boomers. 11 million internet pornography users are under the age of 18. The director of the Masters and Johnson Clinic told me that he was seeing 14 and 15-year-old boys addicted to pornography. When I talked to members of 12-step groups like Sexual Addicts Anonymous, older members talked about, how shocking it was to see how many teenagers were coming in who were profoundly dependent on pornography. And touring around the country to promote this book, I kept hearing again and again from concerned parents saying, I know that my 14-year-old son is looking at extremely hardcore pornography, but what can I do about it? He tells me he needs the computer for school. Or I have a 10-year-old daughter, I don't even want to think about what, she's learning about the opposite sex online. And parents finding, mothers reporting that their daughter had found pornography that their husbands had downloaded online. And toddlers exposed to pornography. When I was in Seattle for my book tour, a nurse told me about how in the playroom, they came across two toddlers reenacting pornographic scenes in the waiting room. This is an email that I got from one mother. My 3-year-old today asked me why Daddy is always watching girls on TV with their titties and butts showing. He watches our daughter often, and I knew he was into porn because I found his stashes, but apparently he's watching porn on the big screen while our daughter is watching too. What effect is this possibly going to have on her? I'm filing for divorce, but fear she's already seen too much.